I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice, tumbling down the rabbit hole. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life. That there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of election, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. But I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people.
And now, welcome to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole. Here's your host from federaljack.com. It's Popeye.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's live edition of Down the Rabbit Hole. Tonight I'm going to be discussing yet again more information about the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Tonight I'm going to be playing audio for you again. The final two episodes of the Men Who Killed Kennedy series, Episode 8 and Episode 9. Now again, if you go on Netflix or if you go on the History Channel to purchase their store, their website, and to purchase the series, you'll only see that it goes from 1 to 6, and it says that it's a 6-part series. Netflix will tell you the same thing. It is not a 6-part series. It is a 9-part series. Again, yesterday you heard Episode 5, which was one of the regular episodes that had aired many times, and then you heard Episode 7, The Smoking Guns. That was one of the 3 that got sent to the memory hole, 7, 8, and 9. And tonight you're going to hear 8 and 9, the other 2 episodes that went to the memory hole. And when you hear them, you'll understand why. Starting off is episode number 8, The Love Affair. That introduces you to my good friend, who you all know now, Judyth Vary Baker, the mistress of Lee Harvey Oswald, and also a scientist who was working at the behest, which she did not know, of the CIA on weaponized cancer. She was 17 years old. She was a scientific prodigy. You've all heard the story before. If you haven't, you don't know who Judith is. You'll hear a little bit about her in this episode, The Love Affair. And if you want to learn her full story, go purchase her book, Me and Lee. You can get it over at judithbaker.blogspot.com. That's Judyth Baker, JUDYTHBAKER.blogspot.com. judithbaker.blogspot.com. You can go there and you can purchase a copy of Me and Lee. And I promise you, you will not be disappointed. And her information is accurate. I spent a great deal of time researching her before I decided to interview her the first time a few years ago. And since then I've interviewed her. I spent over 20 hours interviewing her. And I am glad to say that I have become friends with Judith. And she is a very real person, and she is a very humble person. So if you all don't know who she is, which most of you already do, but if there are listeners that are new and do not, you'll get a brief intro to her tonight, and then go to my archive section and look up, or just go to the search bar on federaljack.com and look up Judyth Vary Baker, and you will see her there, and my interviews with her there. In fact, if you go to the download section, you go to the JFK download section, All of my interviews with her are included in the downloadable section, downloadable archive for JFK there. So you can pull them all there, put them on your smartphone, and listen to them. I promise you won't be disappointed. Anyway, let's get to the episode. Here we go. Episode number 8, The Love Affair.
Time in New Orleans, when the city explodes with color and sound and people go wild. But for one person, New Orleans holds a different kind of magic. Judyth Vary Baker first came here in April 1963, 7 months before Kennedy's assassination in Dallas. She fell deeply in love with a man she met here, who was to change her life forever. That man was Lee Harvey Oswald.
Lee Oswald was an innocent man who gave his life for his country, who was a loyal Marine to the very end, and he deserves better in history than the vile portrait of him that's been painted. This is a man who is a hero, and I stand as a witness to that. Period.
Judith's story, told here for the first time, changes forever our understanding of Lee Harvey Oswald and his role in history. That story begins in Bradenton, Florida, where as a young schoolgirl Judith excelled in science, as her sister Linda explains.
By the time she was in high school, she was extremely dedicated to her work. And when I say to her work, it was her scientific studies, her projects that she worked on. And she always had this interest in cancer research. She wanted to be the person who could cure cancer, and she was determined to do that.
Her exceptional abilities were soon drawing local and then national attention.
When I was in high school, I noticed that I was focusing on things that were of interest to the military. My work with cancer, my work with getting metal out of seawater and all that, excited a great deal of interest. I gave lung cancer to mice faster than it had ever been done before with all their big labs and everything else. They were astonished. And they even went to my school and checked everything out, and of course I had all the proof. All the doors opened from there. I found myself invited as soon as I could graduate. I was sent to Buffalo, New York, to the oldest and most prestigious, at that time, cancer research center in the United States, Roswell Park Memorial Institute for Cancer Research, under the auspices of Dr. Deal and Dr. Ochsner.
Dr. Alton Ochsner, one of the world's leading cancer specialists, was fiercely anti-communist. He was to play a crucial role in Judith's life. Without realizing it, she was being subtly drawn into clandestine research work. This became apparent in 1962, when she became a full-time student at the University of Florida in Gainesville.
I was getting specialized in deadly cancers. It was made clear to me by the time I entered the University of Florida, they didn't want people knowing that we were working on projects that might have to do with eventually competing with Russia on the matter of using cancer as a bioweapon.
She was very gullible. She didn't have people experience. She was always in a laboratory working. So yeah, she was very capable of being taken advantage of without ever knowing it until it was too late.
In the spring of 1963, Judith was invited to join Dr. Ochsner in New Orleans on a temporary assignment. It was an exciting offer for the young scientist. The Ochsner Clinic and its founder were world-renowned.
Dr. Alton Ochsner, who was famous as the first physician to link smoking and cancer, and who had many military and government connections, he said he needed me there, and that he wanted me to work in the bone cancer lab with Dr. Mary Sherman. Dr. Mary Sherman was working on some cutting-edge research, and the blood sedimentation work I was doing they thought would be valuable. On top of that, he'd been telling me what to do for a couple of years now and was interested in everything I was doing. This man was virulently anti-Castro, and he knew about my anti-Castro feelings.
Judith arrived in New Orleans on April 20th, 1963, 2 weeks before she was to meet Ochsner. She was a naive 19-year-old, alone for the first time in a big city. She was to be joined 10 days later by her fiancé, Robert Baker. While she awaited his arrival, Judith took a room at the YWCA, close to the downtown area. The following week, She went to the main post office to pick up a letter from her husband-to-be.
As I asked for the letter from Robert Baker and obtained it, when I reached for it, I dropped the newspaper, and this very clean-cut young gentleman standing behind me picked it up and handed it back. I looked at him, and he smiled, and he's young like I am, and he was so clean-cut and so polite that when he asked me if he could walk me home, I said yes. That was how I met Lee Harvey Oswald for the first time. I have to call it instant chemistry. I never felt such an attraction for anyone, either then or ever in my life since. It was love at first sight, and I know he felt the same way about me too.
New Orleans was Oswald's hometown, and overnight he became Judith's guide and protector. The first person he introduced her to was a man he called Dr. David Ferry, a close friend. They met in a local restaurant.
He was wearing an airline captain pilot's hat, and he had his pilot's jacket on and a ring, and here I'd been told he was Dr. David Ferry, but now I also realized he was Captain David Ferry, had been with Eastern Airlines. This is a man who probably could talk to you on any subject at length. He could discourse on anything, and he could speak knowledgeably to me about cancer research even. He was actually, he said, working on a project. He would like me to see it. He knew Ochsner was. He not only knew Dr. Mary Sherman, she was his friend. So all of these things were of great interest to me. I wanted very much to know more about this strange man, Dr. David Ferry, who was also the captain.
Later that day, Oswald took Judith to David Ferry's apartment in this suburb of New Orleans. Unwittingly, she was being drawn into a deadly game.
David Ferry's apartment was the upper half of a white Spanish-style building, and we entered from the back. People who knew David Ferry would not enter from the front. So as we sat down, and we're sitting down on an antique piece of furniture from his mother. He has nice chintz curtains, but the rest of it looks like 6 or 7 garage sales all slammed together. He had a book on nursing and surgical procedures, how to do operations. He had the DIFCO manual, and nobody has the DIFCO manual unless they're doing cancer research or other kinds of tissue culture and so on. We were there not only most of the day, but all night long that night. And I took reams of notes on what he was saying.
To Judith's amazement, Ferry began to talk about a secret government medical project against Castro, involving himself and Mary Sherman, overseen by Alton Ochsner.
I knew that Dr. Ochsner had been working on a variety of different projects, and that because of his association with anti-Castro people such as David Ferry, this seemed very possible to me that Dr. Ochsner and Dr. Sherman might be involved with David Ferry. And of course he spoke knowledgeably of both people.
However, following a raucous party at Ferry's apartment, Judith began to have reservations about her exotic new friends and their wild claims.
I was already falling in love with Lee Oswald, but I didn't know him that well. So I was concerned, and I asked Lee to show me. I need to find out, really, is the government really involved in this? I might be being lied to. I hadn't even met Dr. Ochsner yet and wasn't supposed to for another few days.
To reassure Judith of his official status, Oswald took her downtown to meet another close associate, Guy Bannister, a former FBI man now operating as a private investigator.
There on the wall, there it was. This man was the head of the FBI in Chicago. He carried a beautiful big gun right there on his shoulder holster. He had all kinds of credentials, and he affirmed that Lee was working on an anti-Castro project. That was good enough for me.
Judith was even more impressed when Lee later took her to the 3rd floor of Bannister's building, where she saw assorted military equipment stored.
Lee told me that he was in New Orleans for several reasons. One of them was to make a training film, and that he was working with these anti-Castro insurgents to help teach some of these young Cubans how to use ammunition, how to, do their guns, how to fire, and all that. He was part of this, but he had several other projects he was also working on. He was a very busy man there.
Less than a week in New Orleans had turned Judith's life upside down. With the arrival of her fiancé, Robert Baker, she faced a difficult choice.
I knew I was falling in love with Lee Oswald, and I knew Lee was falling in love with me. And yet I had strong feelings for Robert Baker, whom I'd known for 10 months. Lee told me at that time that he had beaten his wife, Marina, and he was sorry, and we talked about that, and I told him that that was really disgusting to me. And I wanted nothing to do with anyone who was violent. I believe if Lee had not told me that, I don't believe I would have married Robert Baker.
But she did. Robert had found lucrative employment in the Gulf of Mexico and had one day in which to marry Judith. Work came before romance.
On May 3rd, he kisses me, we have a wonderful tumble in bed, and then he's gone. And he'll be gone for weeks.
Left alone in New Orleans, the newlywed needed secure accommodation. Lee came to her rescue with a convenient rental property.
Lee Oswald moved me into 1032 Marengo Street on May 4th, 1963, and we spent most of the day getting me accommodated. He even brought 4 begonias to put in the windows. Nobody knows, they say, what Lee Oswald was doing on May 4th, but I do. The most important entrance to 1032 Marengo was here in the back. And next to this door in the back is a window and windowsill where we kept the key so that Lee could get in whenever he needed to. The owner of 1032 Marengo was a widow named Susie Hanover. She had the back half, we had the front half. And she was so kind as to warn me and Lee if someone was coming. She liked Lee very much and had known him for a long time, apparently, from the time he had been a young person growing up here in New Orleans.
Shortly after moving in, Judith had a meeting with Alton Ochsner at this hospital, her first since arriving in New Orleans. She did not go alone.
Lee accompanied me there and told me that he had to go in first to talk to Dr. Ochsner. This made me recognize that he had already had a prior association with Ochsner. When I went in, Dr. Ochsner began to explain to me, and I'd already been apprised a great deal more by Dr. David Ferry, about the project that he had been working on for over a year. And this clearly had to do with working with these deadly cancer strains that he knew I was well adept at handling. The idea was to try and get Castro ill, very ill, and eliminated through what seemed a natural cause, in this case, cancer. The attractiveness of the plan that Dr. Ochsner and Dr. Sherman and David Ferry were working on is that up to now, attempts to kill Castro had to involve some kind of violence that could be traced to some country or individual. And that could lead to war. World War III, maybe, if Russia intervened. This was considered, in my mind, a noble experiment, a noble attempt to do away with Castro without anyone getting blamed or with only a few people being involved, because it was biomedical. At any rate, at the end of the summer, he promised me that I would skip 2 years of school and go directly into medical school at Tulane Medical School. Of course, how could I say no?
Having agreed to join the Kill Castro medical team, Judith and Lee were assigned cover jobs at the Riley Coffee Company in downtown New Orleans.
Rain or shine, Lee and I would get off the bus and we'd walk this way to go to Riley Coffee Company in the morning. And what we would do is go through these doors. He would go that direction to the right to the shipping and packing and where the machinery was and the roasters. I would go to the left up into the executive suites where I worked as a secretary for Mr. Monahan.
These payslips and this tax statement confirm Judith's employment at Riley's. However, her real work lay in David Ferry's apartment. Incredibly, this simple kitchen had been turned into a secret laboratory. It was here that Judith, often assisted by Lee, helped develop the deadly virus, ultimately intended for Castro.
It was my job to work with 50 to 60 mice at a time, and these mice had large tumors that had developed. They were being brought in from another nearby locale, some other place. Now, these animals had already been inoculated with cancer when they were weanling mice, very, very tiny, and in a matter of a week or so, the cancer that they had developed at this time, the lumps and the tumors were as large as these little mice. so to the point where they could hardly drag these huge tumors along. And we would actually have to kill these mice, cut out the tumors, weigh the tumors, see which ones were the heaviest, because those were the fastest growing. We were interested in the weight and how fast these tumors grew. We were after a vicious cancer, a galloping cancer. And all the tumor material that seemed to be most vigorous was then placed in a blender and blended together so they could recycle and not lose that virus. And the other thing that we were doing was making tissue cell cultures from the most vigorous and deadly cancers.
Judith regularly took these materials and her reports from Ferry's lab to Dr. Mary Sherman's apartment in a smart part of town.
Down there is St. Charles Street, where the streetcar would just drop me off, and then I had a 1-minute walk down this little corridor here and went in here, crossed into where these people are entering, and went inside, and inside is a nice courtyard, and I entered Mary Sherman's apartment. And I usually drop things off. Sometimes I would stay there and read and wait for her to come. Dr. Mary Sherman was not a person who was anything but gracious and an honorable lady in every sense. I never felt like she was someone who had any vices at all. I felt these contacts were necessary so that there would be some way for her to report on my work and what I was doing as if I were some kind of student working under her anyway, so I could go into Tulane in the fall, which was still the plan.
Mary Sherman secretly carried out vital work on the bioweapon at another location. Oswald was the go-between.
The work that we were doing, without Lee Oswald, it couldn't have been accomplished. He was able to actually move materials over to the U.S. Public Health Center over near the Crippled Children's Hospital, where often Mary Sherman would meet him, and they were exchanging materials all the time. They were using a linear particle accelerator, atomic radiation, to change the genetic components in the virus that we were working with. I was never there myself personally, but I understood that what I was getting was altered genetically in certain ways.
Confined to her kitchen lab, Judith was to spend many hours in Ferry and Oswald's company. One day they introduced her to an old friend.
We had been talking about my dog Sparky the day before. Sparky was a bad little dog who went on my bed. They said they wanted to introduce me to another Sparky, also a dog who couldn't control himself. And this individual's name, they said, was Sparky Rubenstein. Only much, much later did I learn that this was Jack Ruby, and I never connected the two when Lee was murdered. He was very interested in what we were doing there in the lab, and David Ferry openly showed him what was going on, which surprised me. And then he turned his attention to Lee and mentioned some things that showed me that he had known him for quite a while, including a remark made to me. I've known him ever since he was a little boy, when he was at parties and things like that. That's the way he put it.
No official investigation into Kennedy's assassination has found any connection between Ruby and Oswald. In May 1963, Oswald moved into an apartment on Magazine Street, a short walk from Judith's. He was joined from Dallas by his pregnant wife Marina and their baby daughter June.
From time to time, if he had an argument with Marina, he would simply go to my apartment, which was about 7 blocks away as the crow flies. As this was a very busy street, we could get on a bus at any time, and of course we did. We rode the bus, the magazine bus, to and from work at Riley, and so we saw each other daily. We really locked in with a lot of affection. We enjoyed each other's company. The traction was incredible, and a lot of it was chemistry. A lot of it was just personality. Lee and I tried not to sleep together because of our marriage obligations. But the fact is it was a losing battle. And between Lee's disappointment with Marina and my disappointment with my husband, and the tremendous attraction we had for each other, we just couldn't bear it anymore. We found such great pleasure in just being together.
Why not?
Clay Shaw, a close confidant of Oxner's and a leading New Orleans businessman, helped the young lovers. Later, he was to go on trial for conspiring to kill Kennedy, only to be acquitted.
Clay Shaw felt sorry for Lee and me, So he set up so we could actually go to a few hotels, and at each time we went into separate rooms. But at those times we had all the room service, we had food, and we had privacy, and this is in the afternoons. So I mean, he was always home by night, but we couldn't help ourselves. Lee Oswald was a man who was attractive to me, not only physically, but also intellectually. We enjoyed our music, we enjoyed talking, and we enjoyed being in bed together with each other.
As the young lovers were drawn deeper into Alton Ochsner's project, they became increasingly aware of the powerful forces controlling it.
What Dr. Ochsner and Dr. Mary Sherman and Judyth Vary were doing was assembling various products that could be used by the CIA, perhaps by the Mafia, and they were involved with both, that could be used against Castro and against insurgents or mercenaries or groups that were communist that they felt were infiltrating Central and South America.
I'm going to pause it right there, ladies and gentlemen, because we have a break coming up in a few short seconds. Interesting stuff. Weaponized cancer. Lee Harvey Oswald's mistress. If you're not familiar with her, again, go check out her book, Me and Lee. JudithVaryBaker.blogspot.com. JudithVaryBaker.blogspot.com. We will be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back. You're listening to episode number 8 of the Men Who Killed Kennedy series, The Love Affair. If you want to purchase Judith's book and learn more about her story in depth, and she shows all the evidence to back up her claim in the book, you can purchase it over at judithbaker.blogspot.com, judithbaker.blogspot.com. One more time, judithbaker.blogspot.com. The title of the book is Me and Lee. I urge you to purchase it. And another book that backs up her story about the weaponized cancer, and it goes right along with it, and I urge you to purchase it as well, is titled Dr. Mary's Monkey by Ed Haslam. After tonight's broadcast, you're going to go out, if you don't have them already, you're going to purchase 2 books. You're going to go get Me and Lee by Judyth Baker, available at judithbaker.blogspot.com. And then you're going to get Dr. Mary's Monkey from Ed Haslam, which you can also purchase at drmarysmonkey.com. And I believe, if I remember correctly, the word doctor is spelled out. So, drmarysmonkey.com, judithbaker.blogspot.com. You want to purchase Me and Lee and purchase a copy of Dr. Mary's Monkey by Ed Haslam. Both books go together. Ed has interviewed Judith. His book backs up what Judith says. Anyway, let's get right back to the episode. Here we go. Episode number 8, The Love Affair.
As the young lovers were drawn deeper into Alton Ochsner's project, they became increasingly aware of the powerful forces controlling it.
What Dr. Ochsner and Dr. Mary Sherman and Judyth Vary were doing was assembling various products that could be used by the CIA, perhaps by the Mafia, and they were involved with both, that could be used against Castro and against insurgents or mercenaries or groups that were communist that they felt were infiltrating Central and South America.
However, the cancer virus they intended for Castro was proving to be not potent enough. Young Judith came up with the answer.
I convinced Dr. Ochsner and others that the real thing we need to do is pull down Castro's immune system by using several ploys, and then when the cancer is introduced into his body, it would be found in his blood system. They'd put him in front of the X-ray again and again and again. He'd be injected again and again. Supposedly he'd be getting treatments to kill the cancer when actually his immune system is getting destroyed. That could be done. In other words, Castro could be eliminated by using the X-ray, and they'll think that it's the side effects from lung cancer. And that was my idea.
Judith and Lee felt intense pressure to succeed. They were horrified to learn that some of the sponsors of the Kill Castro program were also interested in getting rid of Kennedy because of his perceived failure to deal with the communist threat so close to America's shores.
We were aware of this through Judyth Vary, who had infiltrated groups who were planning or trying to kill Kennedy and or to kill Castro. By focusing on Cuba, if Castro were dead and taking over Cuba again, everybody would be satisfied. The military, the CIA, the mafia, and other elements, the anti-Castroites. Everybody would be happy if Castro were out of the picture. Otherwise, it seemed that these people really basically were focused on eliminating Kennedy, and then they could do as they pleased with Cuba, with another administration. And a lot of these people had a lot of power. It was a frightening thing for me to hear about all these things.
But for Agent Oswald, the Kill Castro project was only one of several undercover assignments that summer, as Judith learned.
First of all, he and Guy Bannister went out and worked with students trying to uncover radicals that were on campus. This is very important. They were getting ready to leave for the summer, and Guy Bannister was convinced that these students would be agitators during the summer for pro-civil rights events and so on. On the other hand, as soon as these students left, which was at the end of May when school got out, Lee was then free, of course, to try and kind of polish up his pro-Castro end of things, because he was supposed to be a pro-Castro person eventually, to be groomed enough and to be able to enter Cuba if they ever wanted him to go to Cuba.
This alleyway behind Riley's had often provided Oswald with the means of slipping away unobserved to pursue these intelligence assignments. But by mid-July, those days were drawing to an end.
They needed an excuse to fire Lee because he'd actually fulfilled all the anti-Castro things he'd done with Guy Bannister and so on, and he was moving into a new phase, and that was to promote his pro-Castro image. That was going to be on television.
Well, I would very definitely say that I am a Marxist, that is correct. But that does not mean, however, that I'm a communist.
Pamphleteering, all kinds of things to make him look like a pro-Castro maniac, practically. And here he's working at Riley. This is a right-wing company. I mean, it would be a disaster. So, of course, they did not want Lee Oswald on the premises anymore.
Lee was fired on a pretext, and Judith soon followed because of her associations with him. But her hard work at the lab had paid off. The cancer virus required just one final test before it's dispatched to Cuba.
It was made clear to me, and I felt very badly about it, that human volunteers, so-called, would have to be relied upon to test the materials. When this was made, when I realized that this was happening, I had some ethical objections.
The plan was to bring prisoners to this Louisiana mental hospital from the Angola penitentiary 30 miles away. Here they would be injected with the cancer virus created to kill Castro, to prove its effectiveness.
Well, I did something I had been told not to do. I wrote a note to Dr. Ochsner, and I signed it with my initials, J.A., and in it I protested the use of human beings at this stage in the project, under the grounds that these were unwitting volunteers. They were not aware that they were going to be injected with live cancer cells, and the goal was to kill them with it. And of course they weren't going to be volunteering for that. So I did object, and Ochsner called me on the phone, and he was furious and said I never should have written anything that was linked to me by any kind of paper or handwriting or anything. If I had any objections, I should have told him in person. And he said at that time that both Lee and I were expendable. And then he slammed the phone down. By expendable, he meant, it was very clear to me and Lee both, that they could get rid of us at any time if we were going to cause problems, because this was a project that was much, much bigger than any little Lee Oswald or any little Judy Baker.
So, in late August, Oswald and Ferry arrived in the small town of Clinton, 130 miles from New Orleans, in a black Cadillac driven by Clay Shaw. Here they met a hospital orderly and awaited phone instructions on where to join the prison convoy, en route from Angola, bringing the volunteers to the nearby mental hospital at Jackson.
It was necessary for David Ferry to make the initial injections. There's a doctor up there who would be taking it on, but he had to be shown how to handle the materials. That was the first thing, and David knew how to do injections. Secondly, Lee had to come along because he had learned all these special techniques to handle the materials. He'd learned them in the lab working with me. And so if the experiment was successful, he was selected as the ideal person to take these materials down to Mexico City, where they would be handed over to a contact, a medical student or a medical technician. And those materials would then be taken over to Cuba and handed over in Cuba to a member of Castro's medical team who could be trusted. So that's why Lee Oswald had to be there. Lee Oswald, the orderly, and Clay Shaw, and of course David Ferry entered into Jackson Mental Hospital behind the vehicle that was transporting these prisoners who were going to be injected. In they all went at the same time. The orderly that was with them that they had picked up outside of Clinton showed them where to go inside, and at that time those prisoners received the injections that were necessary to begin this terrible round of injections and X-ray, injections and X-ray that they hoped would actually kill these people.
Judith's ethical objections to the tests at Jackson had made an enemy of Alton Ochsner. But she was required for one final task. They needed to know if the cancer virus had taken.
This test had to be done within 72 hours, and on August 31st, 1963, Lee Oswald drove me up to Jackson. I was wearing my little white outfit, so I looked like a nurse type. I was taken by the orderly up through a freight elevator and then into this area. This person I was taken to see, who was one of the prisoners who had been injected, was in a bed by himself, and I noticed at once that he was thrashing about and he didn't even know where he was. He was quite ill already. This is only within 72 hours of being injected with this material and having been subjected to these high doses of X-ray. And I did finish my reports. I realized that the method, we had hit 100% here with this gentleman at least, and that he was responding as expected, and apparently the method was going to work.
But Alton Ochsner's anger at Judith was unabated, and he reneged on his promise of a place for her at Tulane Medical School. She now had no alternative but to leave New Orleans and Lee and return to Gainesville with her husband. But the young lovers were determined that their affair would not die. They met for the last time at their favorite hotel.
It was a time of grief and a time of great joy too, because just being with each other in privacy, and we were able to put some of our dreams out there, lay them on the table and say, how can we meet? How can we get together again? How are we going to handle this? This was not goodbye, this was au revoir. We wanted very much to meet again, not only meet again, but to marry. And we were adamant in these hopes of ours. Neither of us wanted to stay the long term with the mate that we presently had. Both of us felt quite neglected by them. Lee told me about a city called Merida that was down in the Yucatan Peninsula that had CIA contacts located there, and that we would find a way to meet in Merida and get married there. And it was the last time I saw him in the flesh, except for a brief glance at him the next day when we pulled out of town, heading toward Fort Walton Beach, Robert's parents' home. And Lee is standing there on the corner. He's dressed in flip-flops and a pair of plain pants and a white T-shirt, and he's reading a newspaper. And he lowers the newspaper, and I'm looking into his eyes as the car turns a corner, and it's the last time I saw him face to face.
At Jackson, within a month of Judith's departure, the first prisoner injected with cancer died. She later learned Oswald traveled to Mexico City in late September to hand over the deadly materials intended for Castro. But his trip was a catastrophe. The drop for the flasks containing the serum was a souvenir shop, but no one showed. Even his main CIA contact, a mysterious Mr. B, had suddenly left for Washington.
He began to do everything he said he possibly could think of that might make him get a chance to meet someone who would be able to take the material from him. And he said at the last, if that didn't work, he even tried to figure out ways himself to get into Cuba because he felt he had enough credentials he might be able to pull it off.
Frantic efforts in Mexico City to secure a Cuban transit visa failed, and a disillusioned Oswald returned to the USA in early October. In Dallas, his handlers told him that Hurricane Flora had brought chaos to Cuba, and the mission to murder Castro had been aborted. He was given new orders.
He would be getting a job, just like he had at Riley. It was all set up in advance at this particular building known today as the Texas School Book Depository building.
In the weeks before the assassination, Lee was still able to confide in Judith, thanks to David Ferry.
he did manage to set up through the mafia a special phone line using their racing telephone lines that they had between Miami and Dallas. And that was perfectly free. We didn't have to spend a nickel. During the 14 or 15 telephone calls that Lee and I exchanged, most of them to me, these calls lasting about an hour to an hour and 45 minutes, the tone of the conversations as time wore on got more and more desperate in a way. Lee was penetrating a ring that he had gotten introduced into by David Ferry and Clay Shaw, and Lee put on the robes of one who was interested in sincerely assassinating the president, and this was not ever the case in reality. It was pretty well known to me by just a little bit before the assassination that Dealey Plaza and the airport and the Trade Mart were the three sites that they were going to try and kill Kennedy. If they didn't get him at one, it would be at one of the others. He didn't know that he might be at Dealey Plaza itself. He even told me the second last phone call we had that they might call him and ask him to go somewhere else at lunchtime or something. And the they I'm talking about became more and more indistinct to him because every time he met one or two of them, it was somebody he didn't know.
Kennedy's arrival in Dallas was now only 5 days away.
When Lee called me on Sunday, November 17th, this was a very harrowing call for me. I'm talking to a man who says, don't feel sorry for me. You've got to understand that this is fulfilling a dream. I might be able to save the president. And he said, that's worth dying for. He said, I'm not scared to die so much. I'm just scared about leaving my kids behind and they'll think maybe I did it because they're going to try to blame me. Now, he's talking this way on Sunday. He had the idea that he never probably would have lived a long time because I said, you know, it's like an oak tree. You're just getting started in your life. And he said, no. He said, I'm like a lily. He said, that's beautiful too. Okay. Anyway, he said, just please don't feel sorry for me. I might have a chance to save the president. And that was so important to him in every way.
On Wednesday, November 20th, 1963, Judith, frantic with worry, called Lee at his workplace, the Texas School Book Depository. He returned her call that evening from a payphone less than 38 hours before Kennedy's assassination.
Our last conversation that lasted over an hour and a half, Lee was trying to assure me that he was not alone and that there was at least one other person, perhaps two, that were involved with him in this matter who were trying to save the president. It's like one group is trying to kill and the other group is going to try to abort. But he made clear to me there wasn't any way that he could actually remove himself from the situation into which he had penetrated. He almost rejoiced that he had been able to penetrate it. It was something that fulfilled him in a way because it meant that he had fulfilled the function that he had always wanted to be, and that is somebody who might be able to make a tremendous difference if he could succeed somehow in saving the president. On the other hand, if he had removed himself, his wife, his little girl, his little baby, me, the people he loved, we would have been slaughtered. We would have been eliminated. And, of course, he would have died anyway. He was in too deep. He couldn't withdraw. It was too late. And then he said, if I stay, there'll be one less bullet fired at Kennedy. And my heart just turned over because I thought that was such a courageous thing to say. And then he said, you know, look at all the people who have kids. He said, you're smart and you love children. He says, please have children for me. Have babies. Please have babies for me. So I had 5. I had 5 babies. And he said that I can't go on right now. In the final minutes of our call, he gave me some of the concerns he had. The most he had been able to find out that there was a connection between the assassination and persons whose names were Billy Solestes and Bobby Baker. Not that they were directly involved, but because of them. He said never to forget their names, and that this was a big event going on at that time in Dallas about them.
Bobby Baker was a corrupt business associate of Vice President Lyndon Johnson. So was Billy Solestes. Investigations into their financial misdealings were threatening to put Johnson behind bars.
And then he said, you know how we've tried and worried about who in the world my handler was. Mr. B, Mr. Bishop or Benson or whatever, Benton. He said, I think it's David Atlee Phillips. He said, and I don't want you to forget it. He said, you've got to remember that name.
Phillips was a high-ranking CIA official in Mexico City in charge of covert action at the time of Oswald's visit there. His connections to the assassination have long been suspected.
And then he told me goodbye. And we were both crying. And I told him I'd never forget it as long as he lived. And he said that might be only until tomorrow. He could crack jokes right to the end. And of course I meant it as long as I lived. So that's the way it was. And I wondered how I'm going to keep my mouth shut, and I knew if I said a word, it could be so dangerous for him. And I just prayed to God he'd make it. And then he said, would you pray for me? And here he's an atheist, and I didn't believe in God anymore either. So I said an Our Father with him. And he said, I love you, Judith. He hung up. That's all. That's it.
Less than 90 minutes after the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested in the Oak Cliff district of Dallas for the murder of a policeman, J.D. Tippit. 12 hours later, he was charged with the murder of President Kennedy. That evening, Judith in Gainesville received a frantic call from David Ferry in New Orleans.
Dave said to me, you have to keep your mouth shut and your head down. He said, I know you're an emotional person. He said, I'm an emotional person. He started really losing it a little bit. And he said, everything's gone wrong. I'm really concerned that, maybe things won't go right, but you've just got to hold on to the hope that we're going to get him out of there. And he said, and I swear to you, I think he said, I swear on a stack of Bibles, or I swear on my life, I am going now. I'm going to go all the way to Houston. I'm going to drive all the way there, go to that little airport at Alief, pick him up, and we'll go over to Hull Field. He'll get on the plane there, and he said, my boys will drive my car back to New Orleans, and I'll fly him to Laredo. He said, even if Lee didn't make it to Alief, even so, he'd be able to find out what was really going to happen to Lee, because he had so many contacts. And just trust him, and hang on, and keep my mouth shut. And then he slammed the phone down.
On the morning of Sunday, November 24th, Oswald was to be moved from the Dallas City Jail, where he had been kept since his arrest, to the greater security of the county jail. The event was televised across the nation. In Florida, Judith was watching.
As I watched, and I'm thinking, they're transferring him. I knew he hadn't made it to the airport. He's been accused of killing the president. And I'd seen over and over again some of the press conferences and things, and I saw how much weight Lee had lost and how thin he'd gotten. I saw the bruise on his eye and the cut on him, and I knew who knows how they're punching him, and the whole thing was, to me, I could see he was just being mauled around, and I knew he wasn't being treated right. So I was feeling horrible, and then I saw him come out, and he's got a nice black sweater on, and he's been shaved, and he looks nice. And my heart turned, and I thought, oh, at last they're going to treat him better. And then they shot him.
He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot. There's a man with a gun.
I think I don't know what happened to me. I don't remember anything literally for hours after he was shot, and I was trying to see what happened, and my friend, I think, started to scream. I think I was crying, and I knew he was dead. For the first time and only time in my life, I wanted to kill myself. I didn't want to live anymore.
Almost 2 weeks after Lee's murder, Vary called Judith from New Orleans for the last time, warning her she would die if she ever revealed what she knew.
He reminded me that the good friend of Godfather of New Orleans, who was Carlos Marcello, that good friend Santos Traficante, was watching to see how I was behaving and that I'm to keep my mouth shut. And he also told me I could no longer expect to shine in any area. I'm not to have any more nice little news clippings or make straight A's or any of that, because I had to be a vanilla girl and be a nobody and keep my head down and make no waves if I wanted to stay alive. He abruptly ended the call, told me he could never contact me again. He told me that I was never to speak about any of this to anybody again, for all our own goods. And I never spoke to anybody about anything because I didn't want to die. No more science work, no more trying to help anybody, no more trying to cure cancer. Everything had gone wrong, everything.
Judith kept her secret for 40 years, but with her children grown up, she finally decided to break her silence before it was too late.
It's been a huge embarrassment to my family, to my children, a shock to them. I've always raised them to be very moral, and here their mother is saying that she was the mistress of an alleged assassin of the President of the United States. I want to make it clear that I'm making this statement at cost to me personally and to my family, but that it is the right thing to do because Lee Oswald is an innocent man, and my only and sole desire is to see his name cleared.
And there you have episode number 8 of The Men Who Killed Kennedy, The Love Affair. Again, Judith's book can be purchased at judithbaker.blogspot.com, and Ed Haslam's book, Dr. Mary's Monkey, can be purchased at drmarysmonkey.com. Ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned. Hour number 1 up. Hour number 2 is coming up. We still have one more episode left, episode number 9, The Guilty Men, so don't go anywhere. We will be right back. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to hour number 2 of tonight's edition of Down the Rabbit Hole. I am your host, Popeye, from federaljack.com. Tonight, we are listening to the final 2 episodes of The Men Who Killed Kennedy. Episodes number 8, The Love Affair, which you just heard in hour number 1. If you didn't, go back and check the archives. And in hour number 2, we're going to hear The Guilty Men. This episode covers Lyndon Johnson and his connection to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Now, some people think that Johnson was the end-all, be-all top of the conspiracy to kill President Kennedy. I do not believe he was the end-all, be-all. I do believe he was brought in on it, obviously, because you can't kill the President of the United States and get away with it unless the Vice President and the head of the FBI are in on it. And he was very good friends with J. Edgar Hoover, who just happened to be the head of the FBI. And Hoover didn't like Kennedy. So it wouldn't be far-fetched to think that him and Johnson, who also didn't have a love for the Kennedys and was going to get dumped by John in the second term and then arrested for his dirty deeds, because Lyndon Johnson had some shady business dealings and a lot of deaths on his hand, or at least on the hands of his henchmen, and he had things he had to pay for. He was a dirty dude. Kennedys knew it. Johnson would have been in a prison cell, not in the presidency. So it's an easy choice. Participate in his murder and stay out of jail, or don't participate in his murder and this guy stays in office, and then who knows what happens to him. And if he doesn't participate in the murder, who knows what happens to him. He could go down just as bad as well. So Johnson was definitely in on it, definitely higher up there, but not at the very tippy top. At least not from my research. But he definitely was involved. Lyndon Baines Johnson was involved in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, without a shadow of a doubt. There's a bunch of books I urge you to go read on the subject about Lyndon Baines Johnson. And I hope this broadcast tonight inspires you to do so. So without further ado, let's get right into the content for hour number 2. The Men Who Killed Kennedy, episode number 9. Again, the 3rd episode of the missing 3 episodes that were put in the memory hole. The Men Who Killed Kennedy, episode number 9. The Guilty Men.
Hello, I'm Steve Gillen, historian for the History Channel. The tragic death of President John F. Kennedy 40 years ago is one of the greatest mysteries in American history. In other programs, we have presented numerous theories about the people and events surrounding the assassination. Many of those scenarios, including a mafia cover-up, CIA involvement, and a possible Cuban connection, have been presented in our series, The Men Who Killed Kennedy. This episode, The Guilty Men, examines yet another theory, that President Lyndon Johnson was involved.
I know, as attorney for Lyndon Johnson, that he murdered John Kennedy. He murdered John Kennedy to become president and to avoid prison, and there is no doubt in my mind.
You can't kill the President of the United States unless the next president, the head of the FBI, and the head of the Secret Service are in on the cover-up.
I'd like the entire world to know how I personally feel is the fact Lyndon Johnson knew about the assassination and was a part of it.
Deep in the heart of Texas lie buried some of the darkest and most well-kept secrets that tell us who killed John F. Kennedy in Dallas on November 22, 1963, and why. Those forces of darkness revolved around one of that state's most famous political sons, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Born in 1908, he grew up in a comfortable middle-class home in Johnson City. At an early age, Lyndon showed a keen interest in politics. From the beginning, he was driven by a determination to win, whatever the cost.
In a word, he was ruthless. There wasn't anything he wouldn't do to get what he wanted, regardless of what it was. And probably the best example would be in 1948 when he was running for the Senate. And he was running against a man named Coke Stevenson. And the election was very, very close, a very small number of votes, which forced a recount. And once they did the recount, they found out a 201 vote error in a little place called Alice, Texas. And eventually they found out that the 201 votes had been added. 1 for Stevenson, 200 for LBJ. As a result, he won by 87 votes, and he was nicknamed Landslide Lyndon.
But the real name, the name used in the backwards that didn't appear in the newspapers, was Lion Lyndon. And that stuck with him the rest of his life.
That rigged ballot became the template for a political career based on bribery and corruption. The full extent of Johnson's criminal activity only began to unravel 11 years after his death. In 1984, at this courthouse in Franklin, Texas, a former Johnson business associate, Billy Celestes, appeared before a grand jury.
According to Billy Celestes, there were 8 murders perpetrated on the part of Lyndon Johnson. The first name was a man named Douglas Kinzer. That was followed by a number of men involved in Estes businesses who were corrupt, and they were all killed with carbon monoxide. Josepha Johnson's name is listed on this Justice Department document. That's Lyndon Johnson's sister. So Estes is accusing the Vice President of the United States of murdering his own sister. And the 8th name listed is the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. And then there is a promise of knowing more. And if Billy Celestes is telling the truth, and there is every reason to believe he is, it gives you an idea of the depth of the corruption and the ruthlessness of Lyndon Johnson.
According to Estes' written testimony, that murderous cycle began in 1951 in Austin, Texas, at this downtown golf course known as Butler's Pitch and Putt. The killer was a Johnson henchman called Malcolm Wallace.
Malcolm Wallace was born and raised in Texas. He was Texas bred, Texas educated, a very intelligent man. And when he graduated from the University of Texas, He was evidently recruited by Lyndon Johnson, and he was given a job at the Federal Department of Agriculture.
John Douglas Kinzer, the golf pro at Butler's Pitch and Putt, was having an affair with Wallace's wife and with Lyndon Johnson's sister.
Lyndon Johnson's sister Josepha was an alcoholic. She was a drug user. She was sexually promiscuous. She had loose lips. And who knows what she might tell Kinzer or others about Lyndon Johnson's political shenanigans.
Malcolm Wallace walked into the Pitch and Putt golf course in Austin, Texas, and shot to death in cold blood John Douglas Kinzer.
Kinzer died here for his indiscretions. Wallace was soon arrested and went on trial in Austin 3 months later.
First-degree murder, open and shut case. He gets a lawyer, known as a Lyndon Johnson lawyer. So Lyndon Johnson is going to do his best to get his friend out of hot water.
During that trial, Lyndon Johnson took a room at a local hotel, and the 10 days that that trial was going, constantly sent runners from the hotel to the courthouse to bring him word of what was going on during the trial. So he followed the pulse of the trial very, very carefully.
Malcolm Wallace is found guilty of first-degree murder, but through influence of Lyndon Johnson, Malcolm Wallace receives a 5-year suspended sentence. Lyndon Johnson was able to get his man out of first-degree murder.
Much of the control Johnson exercised was acquired through an early alliance with a fellow Texan. Edward Clark gained unrivaled power in the late 1930s with a series of high positions in the state government. He became Johnson's lawyer and a formidable ally throughout his career.
The power Edward Clark exercised covered almost every avenue of government power in the state of Texas. He would make sure that important appointments were covered by his men. The judges' control was through their vote. I mean, he had their decision in the palm of his hand. And this was, of course, important because Austin was the capital of the state. Anything that happened legally went through Austin, and that meant it went through Clark. He was known as the secret boss of Texas. He could, and did, arrange for people to be killed. He arranged for money to be laundered. He had that control.
This building in downtown Austin became the headquarters of Edward Clark's all-powerful law firm. Barr McClellan was recruited as a young lawyer in 1966, 3 years after the assassination, unaware of the dark secrets hidden within. Soon after joining, in an after-hours conversation with John Coates, one of the firm's attorneys, Barr was made privy to an astonishing piece of information.
Coates and I started talking, and in the course of it, John told me, if the truth be told, Clark arranged the assassination of Kennedy. It was a kind of statement that you can't easily forget, even though I personally chose not to believe it at the time. It stuck with me. Attorneys know they're acting behind a privilege. They can say things to each other, and this talk would go on at after-hours drinks, at Christmas parties, just traveling on the road. And it was like Johnson had to get Kennedy out of the way. I worked closely with Don Thomas, and Thomas was the business attorney to the president and was the second man in the law firm. Thomas and I did a number of cases together, and we traveled the state because he did not fly. We'd been to Dallas one day shortly after I became partner, and it was driving back, and just out of the blue it seems now, looking back, that Thomas said, "I am the only living man who knows what happened in Box 13. And we know what that meant. That was the stolen 1948 election. I didn't say anything. Sometimes it's best just to listen. And then he looked away and added, but Clark took care of things in Dallas. At that point, what I'd been hearing in the law firm, what John Coates had first told me, I knew was true, because this came from a man that was Johnson's business attorney, one of Johnson's most trusted confidants, a man who worked very closely with Johnson during his maturing years, his growing up years, so to speak, and as president. And when I heard that, there was no question but that Clark had been behind the assassination, and he'd done it for Johnson. I know beyond a reasonable doubt that Johnson murdered Kennedy. He acted through Clark. He saw that it was done, and he did it out of a corruption of power that is unequaled in our history.
You've been watching The Men Who Killed Kennedy, The Guilty Men, a program which presents just one of the many theories about the assassination of John F. Kennedy.
After becoming a senator in 1948, Johnson developed an unrivaled power base in Washington, using his forceful personality, political skills, and corruption. He established himself as one of the most influential men in the nation, but as vice president to Kennedy, he lost much of that authority. By 1961, his past was catching up with him. In Texas, Henry Marshall, a local agricultural official, had begun investigating one of Johnson's illegal sources of funding. Working out of these offices in Bryan, Texas, Marshall had become aware of Billy Solesti's misappropriation of federal cotton allotment funds. Attempts to buy off Marshall had failed, and his investigations were beginning to threaten the vice president himself.
Billy Solestes became worried, Lyndon Johnson became worried, and some of them got together and decided, what are we going to do with Henry Marshall? So on one particular day, according to Billy Solestes, Cliff Carter, an aide to Lyndon Johnson, the vice president of the United States, and Malcolm Wallace got together. And finally, Lyndon made the statement, get rid of him.
On June the 3rd, 1961, Henry Marshall failed to return home. An extensive search was made of the family farm near Franklin, Texas. His only son, Don, was 11 years old at the time and remembers that day well.
My uncle found him on the second attempt when he went out to the place. He was in a very remote location, probably about 3/4 of a mile off the road. My mother had this stone placed here in order to mark the spot. The truck had blood around the sides of it. The side on the passenger side had a dent in the fender behind the passenger door, and that's apparently where my father's head was knocked into the side of the truck, and he had his eye damaged at that point. There were a number of yopon bushes that had been broken, and the gun was laying beside the body, and pretty much nothing else could be seen except signs of a struggle.
Local officials immediately ruled it a suicide, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary.
He had been shot 5 times with a bolt-action rifle. He had enough carbon monoxide in his lungs to cause him to pass out at the time he died. There was no effort made to collect any evidence or preserve the crime scene. They had pretty much determined in their minds that this was going to be a suicide. When Billy Solestes testified before the grand jury in Franklin, he implicated Cliff Carter and Malcolm Wallace as the people that were most involved in my father's murder. Wallace being the trigger man and Cliff Carter being the one who arranged for the murder. I'm firmly convinced that Malcolm Wallace was the killer of my father. Who that would have aided, probably political power behind everything. Johnson would have been aided more than anyone else.
The grand jury concluded Henry Marshall in 1961 was murdered, which means in simple language that the grand jury believed Billy Solestes when he told them that Lyndon Johnson had ordered Malcolm Wallace to kill Henry Marshall.
But Johnson's dark dealings were not confined to Texas. In late summer 1963, one of his long-term partners in crime was about to be exposed for corruption by a Senate investigation.
Bobby Baker was the secretary to the Senate majority. Basically, he was the secretary for the Senate, and he was one of Lyndon Johnson's closest associates. And everything that Lyndon Johnson wanted to perpetrate, he had Bobby's help. Essentially, if somebody wanted to get a military contract and they wanted influence of Lyndon Johnson to help them, they had to pay off Bobby Baker, who would then pay off Lyndon Johnson. It's the world of bribes. Bobby Baker was involved in a call girl service. He was involved in real estate scams. He was involved in dealings with organized crime. He was in dealings with oil men, particularly Clint Murchison, an oil millionaire from Texas. So as a result of all this, Bobby Baker was in big trouble. And with a little bit of inspiration on the part of the Kennedys that they could get Bobby Baker to talk, Lyndon was all done. Lyndon Baines Johnson, if Robert Kennedy had his way, would not only not be on the 1964 ticket as the vice presidential candidate, but he would go to jail for the corruption that he was involved with.
Although Johnson faced political extinction at the hands of the Kennedys, he had powerful allies with their own agendas that threatened the president, as researcher Gregory Burnham explains.
People would think that he had no enemies. He was so popular. He smiled. He appeared happy. Everyone loved him worldwide. But what people don't seem to understand is behind the scenes, he was making changes, and he was making them decisively, and he was taking some very, very daring steps. He was committed to pull out of Vietnam. By October, he had signed a document, an SAM 263, to that effect. 1,000 troops home by Christmas, and all personnel out of Vietnam by 1965. But that wasn't very good for the military-industrial complex. His abolishing the Central Intelligence Agency, pulling their teeth, holding them to task, back to why they were originally created by Truman. Their original mandate by law is only to coordinate intelligence, not to create the Bay of Pigs. NSAM 55 told the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that the CIA no longer can do that, and any military operation has to come directly from them to the president, period. That kind of a document really causes problems.
But Texas was home to Kennedy's most dangerous opponents.
Oil millionaires and billionaires in Texas were petrified of one major factor that John F. Kennedy was considering, cutting the oil depletion allowance. And there was no way they were going to allow that. Essentially, they would save billions of dollars if it stays as it is. It was called a 27.5% oil depletion allowance. John Kennedy thought it was too liberal. One of the key men in this case is Clint Murchison. Clint Murchison is an oil millionaire, owned 500 companies, but he was primarily an oil millionaire. He also controlled Texas, controlled Johnson. His major means of operating and controlling people and influencing people was a little hotel called the Hotel Del Charro in La Jolla, California. It cost $100 a day in the 50s. And at that hotel, he would invite all these powerful, influential people. Richard Nixon would come there. Key lieutenants of Carlos Marcello, the head of the mafia in New Orleans, used to vacation there. J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, used to vacation there. Free. Every summer for 10 summers. Free.
Another Johnson man with close ties to Murchison was a wealthy Texan called D.H. Byrd.
D.H. Byrd was an underboss for Murchison. He was a Del Charro regular. He owned the Texas School Book Depository. He also founded the Civil Air Patrol, which was a kind of military organization, and Lee Harvey Oswald was a member of the Civil Air Patrol. Another associate of Murchison at the time is Bobby Baker. Bobby Baker's in trouble with the scandals, and he was in all kinds of business deals with Murchison, and many of them were illegal. So Murchison was concerned that Baker and that corruption would lead to his door. And maybe not only would Baker go to jail and Lyndon go to jail, but maybe Murchison would go to jail.
As the forces hostile to Kennedy grew in strength and number, they began to think the unthinkable: assassination. Finally, a new imperative forced their hand.
Lyndon Johnson was in big trouble. The Bobby Baker scandal and the Billy Celeste scandal could destroy Lyndon Johnson's career. Lyndon Johnson would go to jail, and he was their man. He represented all these right-wing forces. There was an urgency to kill President Kennedy. They had to save Lyndon Johnson. The governor of Texas, first of all, is Lyndon Johnson's best friend in history. They went back decades together. In the 1948 vote scandal, John Connally was every much a part of that cover-up that took place. He was his campaign manager. It is without question John Connally who entices John F. Kennedy to Texas. Once they get him there, then they're in control of everything. Motorcade routes, the evidence, the Dallas police, everything. It's their land. It's their territory. Lyndon Johnson and his Texas cronies suckered President Kennedy to Texas.
The late Madeleine Brown gained a unique insight into Johnson's role in Kennedy's assassination. She first met LBJ in 1948 at the Adolphus Hotel in downtown Dallas, when he was celebrating his election to the Senate following the infamous Box 13 scandal.
I went, I was very young, and it was wonderful. Our relationship developed immediately. Lyndon gave another campaign party in Austin. It was 3 weeks after I met him at the Adolphus, and it was scheduled at the Driscoll Hotel. And, oh, it was so great to see him. I mean, for 3 weeks I had thought about him and how wonderful it was. We were dancing that night, and he says, I'll see you upstairs. And he put a key in my hand. I still have that key. It was exciting. I felt naughty, but I felt good. I fell deeply in love with him. Yes, I did. I was just the other woman in his life, and my emotions are still the same for him as they were when I met him as a very young girl, but I'll always love him. He was the father of my son, Stephen.
That intimate relationship with Johnson continued for many years. Through him, she became familiar with the closed world of power politics in Texas.
I'm going to pause it right there, ladies and gentlemen. We got a break sneaking up on us. Don't go anywhere. I'm going to pick it up right where I'm leaving it off as soon as we get back in from the other side of the break, so don't go anywhere. More evidence proving Lyndon Baines Johnson was involved in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Stay tuned.
As the forces hostile to Kennedy grew in strength and number, they began to think the unthinkable: assassination. Finally, a new imperative forced their hand.
Lyndon Johnson was in big trouble. The Bobby Baker scandal and the Billy Celeste scandal could destroy Lyndon Johnson's career. Lyndon Johnson would go to jail, and he was their man. He represented all these right-wing forces. There was an urgency to kill President Kennedy. They had to save Lyndon Johnson. The governor of Texas, first of all, is Lyndon Johnson's best friend in history. They went back decades together. In the 1948 vote scandal, John Connally was every much a part of that cover-up that took place. He was his campaign manager. It is without question John Connally who entices John F. Kennedy to Texas. Once they get him there, then they're in control of everything. Motorcade routes, the evidence, the Dallas police, everything. It's their land. It's their territory. Lyndon Johnson and his Texas cronies suckered President Kennedy to Texas.
The late Madeleine Brown gained a unique insight into Johnson's role in Kennedy's assassination. She first met LBJ in 1948 at the Adolphus Hotel in downtown Dallas, when he was celebrating his election to the Senate following the infamous Box 13 scandal.
I went, I was very young, and it was wonderful. Our relationship developed immediately. Lyndon gave another campaign party in Austin. It was 3 weeks after I met him at the Adolphus, and it was scheduled at the Driscoll Hotel. And, oh, it was so great to see him. I mean, for 3 weeks I had thought about him and how wonderful it was. We were dancing that night, and he says, I'll see you upstairs. And he put a key in my hand. I still have that key. It was exciting. I felt naughty, but I felt good. I fell deeply in love with him. Yes, I did. I was just the other woman in his life, and my emotions are still the same for him as they were when I met him as a very young girl, but I'll always love him. He was the father of my son, Stephen.
That intimate relationship with Johnson continued for many years. Through him, she became familiar with the closed world of power politics in Texas. On the eve of Kennedy's assassination, she attended a party at this house in North Dallas, the family home of oil billionaire Clint Murchison Sr. There was an extraordinary guest list that night.
We had H.O. Hunt, Murchison, Lyndon Johnson made an appearance. We had Hoover, we had Richard Nixon. They were the most influential people there. But I was under the impression that since J. Edgar Hoover was there, that it was to honor Hoover rather than anything else. When Lyndon came in, no one was expecting him. So when Lyndon arrived at Clint Murchison's, they all went into a conference room, and you could just feel the atmosphere. And when Lyndon came out, I was, of course, happy to see him. I did not know that he was going to be there. And he whispered in my ear at that time, "Those blank-de-blank Kennedys will never embarrass me again. That's no threat, that's a promise." So he departed. The party rapidly broke up after Lyndon departed.
A seamstress and companion, May Newman, provides confirmation that this party took place at the Murchison family home on the eve of the assassination. She lived and worked in another Murchison house in Dallas for Virginia, Clint Sr.'s second wife. She speaks here for the first time.
I started working for Virginia Murchison in 1962 until her death in 1997, approximately 36 years. I remember well the night before the assassination. I worked with a man called Jewel Pfeiffer, black man, which was Virginia Murchison's chauffeur. He got a call from her stepson, John, at the big house. They were having a big party for a very special guest that was coming from Washington to go to the party by the name of Bulldog, which I found out later was J. Edgar Hoover. And he said he was very excited about doing this, going on this trip out to the airport to take this special guest to a very special party, big party. And I asked him when he came back if he got a good tip, and he said no, and he was very, very upset. He had to go back that night to take J. Edgar Hoover to the airport to go back to Washington. And he still didn't get a tip.
Further verification of Hoover's presence in Dallas on the eve of the assassination came from a friend of May's who worked at the Murchison family home.
Beulah May Holman, she was the cook at John and Lupe's house, and she wanted me to go help her that night, which I didn't, but I knew she told me she was cooking quail, and I wanted the recipe, so she gave it to me. She said that it was a very important guest by the name of J. Edgar Hoover that was coming, and I should go out and help her so I could get to meet him. If it was a film star, I probably would have gone, but I didn't know who he was. No, not at that time.
Early the next morning, only a few hours before the assassination, Madeline received a phone call from Johnson, who was back in Fort Worth with Kennedy.
Lyndon called me from the Texas hotel, and he was still irate. I said, "Lyndon, about last night," and he went to cursing. He used foul language all the time. And he said, those Kennedys, he repeated, they will never embarrass me again. That's no threat, that's a promise. And I'd like the entire world to know how I personally feel is the fact Lyndon Johnson knew about the assassination and was a part of it.
Dallas was to become forever linked with the murder of the president. But the rich and powerful men who had met in secret the night before had everything to gain from his death. LBJ was fearful of a long prison sentence, J. Edgar Hoover of losing his job, and the oil men of losing millions of dollars. When the shots rang out on Elm Street the next day, those problems were solved. The shock of Kennedy's assassination and its brutality reverberated around the world, but not everyone was grieving.
The mood in the Murchison family home was very joyous and happy for a whole week after, like champagne and caviar flew every day of the week. But I was the only one in that household at the time that felt any grief for his assassination.
After the president's murder, Hoover had absolute control of the cover-up. All the physical evidence relating to the crime was swiftly removed to Washington. From the beginning, Oswald was promoted as the lone nut assassin, but in LBJ's home state, tongues were wagging.
I met Lyndon on New Year's Eve at the Driscoll Hotel in Austin, and the people in Dallas, I mean, everyone was talking about Lyndon Johnson was the cause of the assassination, and it made my heart very heavy. I just couldn't believe that he could be a part of something so bad. So I confronted Lyndon. I said, Lyndon, you've got to tell me, were you part of the assassination? And of course he had a high temper fit, hit the wall, and he was very irate and angry. And he said, no, I was not, but the oil people, or he called them the fat cats of Texas that I knew, and the intelligence was the cause of the assassination. I am sure Lyndon did not make the plans per se, but he had the key people that he could call to actually do it.
If the head of the FBI and the head of the Secret Service and key lieutenants of those two figures are involved in covering up, plus the President of the United States and all his cronies, you don't need a massive conspiracy to get away with this.
After the assassination, Cliff Carter, Johnson's aide, made repeated calls from the White House to the district attorney in Dallas, Henry Wade. He was instructed to look no further than Oswald for the guilty man. There was no conspiracy. A similar call was made to the Attorney General of Texas, Waggoner Carr.
Then we have Lyndon Johnson himself calling the chief of homicide, Will Fritz, who's really doing the dirt work as far as interrogating Oswald and trying to get to the bottom of this case. He calls him and tells him, you have your man. You have your man. Let it go at that. Lyndon Johnson is trying to control what is going on with the investigation of the assassination of President Kennedy from Washington, D.C., with crucial figures in the case.
The late Dr. Charles Crenshaw experienced the new president's controlling hand. He was in the operating theatre at Parkland Hospital with his colleagues, working to save Oswald's life after Jack Ruby had shot him. He was urgently called to the phone in an adjoining office.
I picked up the phone, and it was there I heard this voice like thunder that stated, "This is the president, Lyndon B. Johnson." And he asked, "How is the accused assassin doing?" I was so startled. The thing that I could say was, he's holding his own. He's lost a large amount of blood. He said, "Would you take a message to the chief operating surgeon?" It was more of an order than a question. So I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "There is a man in the room. I would like for him to take a deathbed confession." And all of a sudden, the phone went off. I returned to the operating room. I tapped Dr. Shires on the shoulder, He looked at me like, what are you talking about? Everyone was working feverishly in the abdomen trying to correct the wounds there. I said, guess who I've been talking to? I said, the President of the United States called and wants that man over there to take a deathbed confession. And Shires looked at me like I was crazy, and we both realized that there was no way Lee Harvey Oswald, had he survived, would have been able to give any testimony until 2 or 3 days after the procedure. But still in all, the President had called, and I did relay the message.
When Dr. Crenshaw published his story in 1992, he suffered an avalanche of criticism. It was argued that Johnson made no such call. Crenshaw's critics were proved wrong by a former chief switchboard operator at Parkland Hospital, Phyllis Bartlett.
The call came in and said, hold the line for the President. And for a second, I couldn't, I was still thinking Kennedy, and I was kind of taken back for a minute, and then in a few seconds, it was just a matter of a second that he came on in a loud voice. He said, this is Lyndon Johnson, connect me to the accused assassins, doctor. It sounded the same as it had been on newscasts when I would hear him speak. I knew I had put a call to the operating room, so I contacted Dr. Crenshaw, and I told him, that I knew he did get the call, and that I was sorry that the people had, in the newspaper and on the TVs, had tried to discredit him. And that was when I spoke out.
From the moment he became president, Johnson had authority over every aspect of the cover-up of Kennedy's murder. He was unassailable.
Johnson has the power to contain the investigation, both nationally and locally, on the ground in Texas. More so than if it had happened, let's say, in Oregon or Wisconsin. Texas. He's got the power to give the CIA what it wants as president, as opposed to Kennedy, who they feared. He's got the power to take the National Security Action Memorandum that Kennedy had signed in November 1963, tear it up, reverse it, and create a war where 3 million soldiers wound up going to Vietnam instead of 16,000 being brought home by JFK. He can make J. Edgar Hoover director of the FBI for life. He's the man in the middle. The only person that can answer all of the questions of who's at risk, who's going to gain the most, who wins in this deal, there's only one answer to that question, and that's Lyndon Johnson. And his ticket out was Elm Street.
One of the most compelling pieces of evidence linking Johnson with the assassination is through his henchman Malcolm Wallace, the convicted killer of Douglas Kinzer. In the hours following the assassination, on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building by the southeast corner window, the Dallas police discovered an unidentified fingerprint.
The fingerprint, is the ultimate part of the Mac Wallace story. The FBI fingerprinted every Texas School Book Depository employee, including the women employees who worked downstairs, never handled the boxes. They fingerprinted every Dallas officer that was in the sniper's nest so that they could remove those fingerprints from consideration. At the end of the day, you have one fingerprint remaining. It sits in the National Archives for 35 years, until 1998. An investigator takes it to a highly qualified, certified latent print examiner, a CLPE, along with a redacted fingerprint card from Mac Wallace from the 1951 murder of John Douglas Kinzer. And he said, here's a print card. Do you see anything?
Nathan Darby is one of the most experienced fingerprint experts in the United States, with 35 years service in the U.S. military and the City of Austin Police Department.
I didn't know where it came from, and a week or 10 days later, I called the party and they had brought it over and said, well, it's a match. The finger that made the ink print also made the latent, and we call that a match or identified. And there was no question about it. They matched.
3 years later, Nathan Darby readdressed the same evidence and reconfirmed his original findings.
When he was done, he had a 34-point match. And when you mention that in criminal circles to an investigator, how confident would you feel with a 34-point match? Oh, that's a slam dunk. It can't miss. It doesn't get any better than that. You give me a 34-point match on any case in the United States, I'll take it to court and win.
The inked and the latent prints are made by the same finger. And the other evidence that I've been presented with was Malcolm Wallace's left little finger, without a reasonable doubt.
Now, the fingerprint in question came from a cardboard box in the sniper's nest in Texas School Book Depository. Fingerprints do not last long on cardboard. So it's fair to say that either Malcolm Wallace was wandering around there for no purpose. He was in that sniper's nest on November 22nd. That evidence, that fingerprint evidence, along with Malcolm Wallace's sordid resume, was sent to every imaginable agency or individual that could have an interest in what happened to John Kennedy. The only people that took notice of it were the Dallas police, because it's still an open homicide on their blotter. And they took serious notice of it. And then they were told, forward it up the line, because Dallas no longer has any evidence. It's all in federal hands, even though it's an unsolved homicide. They forwarded it up the line. And it took 18 months for the FBI to say verbally, no, it's not a match. And the single most important fingerprint found in the last 35 years was buried.
I don't know why they couldn't say that the thing didn't match. It did match. There's no question about it. My experience, I've just had too much experience. I know what I'm talking about. I'm positive. There's no question about it. My dying declaration, if I was to drop dead right now, they match.
It's still the big lie. It's unknown. It's unidentified. No, it's identified. It's Malcolm Wallace, and he's linked to Estes, Carter, and Lyndon B. Johnson directly.
According to the official record, Malcolm Wallace died in a single car accident on this lonely stretch of Texas highway on the night of January 7th, 1971. There were no witnesses. His body was taken to a local hospital where he was pronounced dead. He was buried here close to other family members. 8 months later, another key member of LBJ's inner circle, presidential aide Cliff Carter, died unexpectedly. But shortly before his death, he met with Billy Solestes.
They discuss all these murders that Cliff Carter is knowledgeable about. Now, Billy knows about some of them, but Cliff knows about more, and he fills him in on all the details. Malcolm Wallace being a central figure in most of these murders. And there are over 17 murders that Carter tells Estes about. And he actually tells Estes that he fears for his own life. And within 2 days' time, he's dead.
Johnson's attorney, Edward Clark, was one person who prospered. But when LBJ was brought low by the Vietnam War and decided not to run for a second term, Clark felt shortchanged for his role in the assassination, according to his legal partner, Barr McClellan.
He expected $8 million spread over 8 years, over the 2 terms Johnson was to serve. When those terms were cut short by Johnson's sudden and unexpected resignation, Clark was $4 million short. He was not a man to be denied. When he had done a service, he was going to be paid. Planning ahead, he went to Big Oil and Big D, went to Clint Murkison to say, look, I've done y'all a great service. I deserve more. I'm going to get it. Murkison agreed with him and suggested he file for a well in the middle of the great East Texas oil field. He called me in as his personal attorney to make the first bid for getting that money, and he was not successful in getting $4 million, but he got his $2 million. So when all was said and done, Clark realized $6 million for the assassination of John Kennedy.
Barr McClellan believes documentary proof of these dark deeds lies in the Johnson-Clark legal records. For many years they were kept in a high-security area above the Clark offices, known as the penthouse.
Any of us attorneys could get into the general area, but the secret area, the Johnson area, was locked off, accessible to no one. I have a strong belief that there are substantial records somewhere that show this conspiracy and its both evolution, its execution, and its cover-up. But I don't know where they'd be. We need to see them.
Johnson was ultimately consumed by the high office he had so unscrupulously striven for. A broken man, he retreated to his Texas ranch, where his lawyers were to secretly summon a psychiatrist to deal with his deepening depression.
An immediate concern at the law firm was that he would say too much. The $1 million was available to the psychiatrist to keep anything from coming out. The one reason for all these protections was the greatest demon that was dogging Johnson at the time, and that was the assassination of John Kennedy and the role he played in it. We had to keep it covered up, and for sure we had to keep the psychiatrist muzzled, and we did. But if any one set of records needs to be produced, the psychiatric records should be disclosed to the American public, because they will, I am confident, disclose his role in the assassination.
Only 4 years after leaving office, Johnson died. But there are those living who are still afraid to come forward to tell what they know about the guilty men.
People are afraid of him dead. He's been dead since 1973, and his shadow still casts fear in this country, especially in Texas.
Undaunted, across the nation, the questioning voice of the American people will not be silenced. An overwhelming majority refuse to accept their government's version of what happened in Dallas on November the 22nd, 1963.
There's no statute of limitations on murder. If they're still continuing to cover it up in 20 more years, that's obstruction of justice. It's a conspiracy. The men who killed Kennedy don't end with the people who pulled triggers. It should be important to all of us that we get to the bottom of this.
Just as John Kennedy's car took an incredible turn when it went on to Elm Street, 300 feet later, our form of government, our way of life, our way of respecting our government, our way of being respected by our government, took that same kind of bizarre wide turn, and we haven't gotten back on the straight and narrow yet.
The Kennedy assassination was the end of faith in government. And so it's up to the little man to fight the odds. Davy Crockett, Sisyphus pushing his rock. Someone has to keep fighting the odds. And even though you know the chances are that you're never going to get a resolution to what you're fighting for, you have to fight for it anyway. Just the principle of justice. Just the principles of American democracy. Don't give up. Keep fighting.
This episode has presented one viewpoint. We have also presented many other theories in numerous programs. For the History Channel, I'm Steve Gillen.
There you have it, ladies and gentlemen, a mountain of evidence showing Lyndon Baines Johnson was involved in the murder of President John F. Kennedy. And he had plenty of reasons to do so. Not just covering his own butt, but helping friends out and business associates as well. I hope this urges you to look further into the matter. Again, go to federaljack.com, go to the download section, go to the JFK archive, and you can download a ton of information there, including all 9 of the episodes of The Men Who Killed Kennedy, and watch them over and over and over again. And I urge you to show these to your family, show these to loved ones, get other people interested in the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Ladies and gentlemen, we are out of time. I love you all. I'll catch you all again tomorrow night.